Warning: the following podcast might be too truthful for most liberals. Listener discretion is therefore advised.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. I am Mark Galar, your host, and we got a great show for you today. Our guest today is Victor Davis Hanson. He's here to talk to us about his new book, The End of Everything. Victor is a senior fellow in military history and classics at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's a professor emeritus of classics at the California State University in Fresno, and he is also the author of more than 24 books, including A War Like No Other, The Second World War, and The Dying Citizen. He's here to talk to us about his brand new release, The End of Everything, How Wars Descend into Annihilation. Mr. Hanson, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This book begins with a brief history of various cultures that were completely annihilated: the Thebans, the Carthaginians, the Byzantines, and the Aztecs. And I was wondering if you could sort of go through all four of those and give the listener kind of a brief history. And then from that point forward, we might look at some commonalities, some common threads that ran through all four of these, and what that might portend for the modern world.
Well, thank you. Well, it's very rare in history for the losing side in a war to be annihilated. I mean, in the sense of erased, population gone, infrastructure destroyed, language, religion, culture vanished within a few years after their surrender or defeat. But it happens, and I looked through history at various examples, and I chose four. One was classical Thebes, a city-state in the 4th century that rebelled against Macedonian control and was convinced that its walls, that its traditions, that it's the home of the mythical Oedipus, Antigone of plays that we still read, it couldn't happen to them, meaning they couldn't be destroyed. Well, 21-year-old Alexander the Great swept down, besieged the city in one day, not just defeated the rebellious Thebes, but killed almost all of the males, enslaved the women and children, and destroyed the entire city down to the foundations, and it disappeared. Same thing happened with Carthage about 200 years later, when after 2 Punic wars, the Romans had fined it. They had given conditions under which Carthaginians had to perform. They couldn't have allies. They couldn't be involved in wars. And yet they fulfilled every one of those conditions. But the Romans were worried because 50 years later, the city was booming with 500,000 people. And that convinced the Carthaginians that they were as strong as they had been in the past when they weren't. It was more like a Singapore or Hong Kong, a commercial city. The Romans landed, besieged it. They had a brilliant commander who took over the long siege, Scipio Aemilianus, and they did the same thing. They enslaved the survivors. They killed probably 450,000 people. They erased the city down to the foundations. There was no more Punic, Carthaginian religion, language, culture within 20, 30 years in North Africa. Same thing happened in Constantinople in the famous 1453 siege of the Ottoman Empire. The city had been in existence for 1,100 years. The Ottomans came in with a huge army of 200,000. They besieged the city. The city held out for almost 2 months. And then when help didn't come and they were in reduced numbers, they breached the walls, ran in, sacked the great cathedral, Hagia Sophia, then for 3 days slaughtered the population, raped women, enslaved the survivors, and destroyed much of the city, but also used a different sort of DNA and flipped it over as the capital of the new Ottoman Empire, which it is today, in the sense that Istanbul is now the capital and has been of Turkey. And the final was the assault of a very small force by Hernan Cortez, who landed in what is now Mexico in 1519. He marched inland, discovered this huge empire, indigenous people, 4 million people, with a capital where Mexico City is today, called Tenochtitlan, probably 400,000 people on this lake city. And in the period of 2 years, with no more than 1,500, he attacked them, enlisted indigenous people who were resentful of the human sacrifice, cannibalism of the Aztecs, and in the space of about 3 months, destroyed the city down to the foundations. The Allies mostly, but also the Spanish, killed almost all of the survivors who were not killed by disease, enslaved many, and then destroyed the city and used the materials to rebuild a Spanish city right on top of it called Mexico City of today. And in all these, I was wondering what was the common denominators that you pointed out. And
Yes.
all of these cities and empires had been very preeminent. And Thebes had been around for 1,100 years, Carthage for 800 years, Constantinople for about 1,200 years, the Aztecs for 300 years. And their walls or their defenses had never been breached. And they were not aware that their populations were declining, that their territories had been carefully but insidiously and continuously sliced off by enemies. They didn't have the same type of leadership that had made them so important and powerful. And most importantly, they had no idea of the intent or the agenda or the capability of the people who came not just to defeat them in war, but to wipe them out. Alexander the Great, Scipio, Mehmed II, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and Hernan Cortez. These were not Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, Attila the Hun, killers that just swept in and left after plundering, raping, and killing. They were systematic philosophers even. Alexander was a student of Aristotle. Scipio had Polybius with him at the final destruction, the great historian of the Hellenistic period. And they had a plan to eliminate them, but in the sense of there is going to be no more Thebans, there's going to be no more Carthaginians, there's going to be no more Byzantines, there's going to be no more Aztecs. And they accomplished that, sometimes with the aid of allies, but mostly on the naivete, as I said, of the defenders who didn't quite comprehend that the existential danger they were in. And then in an epilogue, I tried to look at places in the world today where we see these threats coming from particular nations, especially against vulnerable neighbors with small populations or with a history of suffering, Holocaust or genocide. And yet we in the West don't really take it seriously. We just think it's Putin or the Chinese communist or Erdogan or Kim Jong-un sounding off. And yet, if you look at it dispassionately and disinterestedly, I don't think the United States has the power, financial, economic, military that it has vis-a-vis these aggressors in the past, and it could very well happen again. And that's how I try to use these examples as a word of warning about America's need to reboot, so to speak, have some kind of renaissance, but more importantly, to take the Chinese communists seriously, or the North Koreans or the Iranians, because what can't happen often sometimes does.
You mentioned in the book that a collective naivete can get a vulnerable people killed. And when I was reading that, I immediately thought of the United States. I mean, we have the Pacific and Atlantic protecting us. We have the world's strongest economy. We have the world's second strongest nuclear arsenal. And there's kind of this invincible feeling. There was a movie called Top Secret starring Val Kilmer as a character named Nick Rivers. And this was set during World War II, and he was continually going on these very dangerous missions. And when people would say, "Oh, please be safe, may God be with you," he'd say, "Oh, they can't hurt me, I'm American." And that's the way I think a lot of us feel. Although when you mention Iran, a nuclear-equipped Iran is one of the most scary things I could possibly think so. But we all have this feeling. We're in the United States. We're somewhat isolated. We're very powerful. And kind of like the four examples you gave in the book, we sort of have this blend of naivete and hubris that gives us this feeling of invincibility. What would you say to Americans who feel like that?
Well, I would say let's not just think of the great things we've done in the past: World War One, victories, World War II, the creation of the post-war order, the victory over Soviet communism. But look at dispassionately our assets and our deficits, and we're borrowing $1 trillion every 90 days. We're short 45,000 recruits to the military, and that demographic is the one that dies, usually rural, lower middle class white males who dies at double their numbers in the population in Afghanistan and Iraq. So these are people who like to join the military and join combat units. For a variety of reasons, they're turning their back on the military. They just don't want to do it, whether DI or the perception it's woke, or drumming people out that had natural immunity because they weren't vaccinated. Whatever it is, it's very dangerous. We're borrowing more. The interest on the money that we're borrowing exceeds the defense budget, which has never happened before. When you look at the interior of the country, we've never had 55 million people, nor have we ever had 16%, which that number represents, of the population that was not native born. That's an enormous task of assimilation, integration, and yet we're reverting back to tribalism, where we just let people identify by their superficial appearance rather than any commonality as an American. If you look at, we have plenty of energy to be energy completely self-sufficient, but we're not fully utilizing our natural resources for a variety of reasons. We're watching one of the biggest exodus migrations in the history of the United States, much bigger than the Oklahoma diaspora of the 1920s, where literally millions of people are leaving California, Illinois, Massachusetts, but especially New York, and going to red states. And that's kind of a force multiplier, geographical force multiplier of these two different cultures that are arising in America, and they're kind of antithetical. And then we're doing things that we have never done before, and we're kind of oblivious to it. And it very weakens us abroad and divides us here at home. We have never impeached a president twice. We had never tried a president in the Senate when he was a private citizen. We have never tried to take the leading presidential candidate off the ballot in various states. We've never indicted an ex-president and current leading presidential candidate in 4 different courts, 3 of which are just local and state prosecutors, with a general consensus that these crimes would have never been lodged against Trump. And more importantly, they'll never be lodged against anybody else because of their absurdities. So this is all new, what we're doing, financial, military. And the results are, when you look abroad, the Afghanistan humiliation, the turnover of $50 billion in weapons, the Ukrainian invasion, which we've had 4 previous administrations, Obama, Trump, Biden, and George Bush, and he invaded in 3 of them, he being Putin: Ossetia, the Donbass and Crimea, and the attempt on Kiev. He didn't invade in 1. But now I think that deterrence is lost. And then we had the Gaza war. I think that was a result of daylight between us and Israel, or the perception that we would not do anything vis-a-vis Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas. And then we had the Chinese balloon that with impunity. I could go on, but the picture is that we're not aware of all this. And we're very naive. We think the Chinese would never absorb Taiwan. It just wouldn't happen. Kim Jong-un is a nut. He would never launch a missile if his country was starving or if he felt paranoid. We just don't think that Recep Erdogan is serious when he threatens to kill Armenians or kill Greeks. That would never happen. Same thing with the 15 or 16 threats that have come from Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons, should they start to lose in Ukraine. And I could go on, but it's very similar, the denial and the miscalculation about the intentions of some very dangerous people and their capabilities.
So we're seeing a similarity between America's opinion of itself now and the 4 other examples that you gave.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
We need to take a quick break, and we will be right back.
You're listening to Mark Goulart. He explained the way things really are.
And we are back with Victor Davis Hanson discussing his new book, The End of Everything. One of the things that also frightens me, Professor Hanson, was that when I'm on the internet, on social media, I hear so many people not just discussing the possibility of another civil war here in America, but actually stating that they would look forward to one. I don't think they realize what they're asking for. But given this extremely divided nature that we have right now in the United States, do you think such a thing could ever be possible?
I don't know how it would manifest itself, but I think we are starting to resemble 1850 to 1860, just simply because we're adding geographical elements to the ideological differences. People in our federal system can self-select. So what's happening, we have this huge exodus. And so today, when you leave the coastal California and you go to Tennessee or Florida or Texas, they're completely antithetical systems on every issue: guns, taxes, abortion, race, you name it. It's completely different. And it's one way in the sense that no one in red states, so to speak, are going to blue states. It's all the opposite. And you would think that that would be impossible because New York is supposed to be the most vibrant city in the world, and California is the most beautiful state in the world. And this is where Silicon Valley and all the universities are on the coast. But it's almost as if paradise has turned into the natural paradise has turned into a catastrophe, and people know that, and they know why it happened. And they don't want those to be the models for the United States. And I think globalization had a lot to do with it as well. I think the coastal areas on both the east and west corridors really profited from this 8 billion person market in media, corporate, academia, law, entertainment, and the people in between that relied more on muscular labor and construction, assembly, mining, farming, transportation. They didn't do as well when jobs were outsourced or offshored. And out of that decline in middle class wages in the interior especially, there became a false explanation that we heard our politicians, you're irredeemable, you're deplorable, you're a clinger, you're a chump, you got to learn how to code, I'm going to put you minors out of business. And so I think between the radicalization of the left, and I think we've never seen a Democratic Party quite like this, and globalization, we're starting to draw apart.
I am 60 years old. I'll be 61 in less than a month. And if you would have told me in, 1981 when I was at Texas A&M, that one day we would be at a point where we would be arguing with people about whether or not a man could become a woman could become a man, or if you had told me that African American students were demanding to have separate graduation ceremonies, or that we would be debating whether a man can get pregnant and nurse a baby, I think, like a lot of people in that year, I would have told you that you're absolutely nuts, that there is no way America would ever sink so low as to be having these crazy conversations. But yet here we are. So in your opinion, how have we gotten to this point? Is this well-planned Marxism, or is it something else?
Well, I think part of it, ironically, is that we enriched a group of people on the coast, and I mean Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the universities, the foundations, the institutions, Hollywood entertainment, and they became very, very powerful. So if you do a Google search, the order of the results will be adjusted for ideological, political reasons. Social media is part of this progressive project. We've seen Disney and Target and Bud Light and United Airlines. You see the foundations that are funding this radical change so that 70% of our voters don't cast a ballot on election day. And out of that, I think they're out of that tension, and they advanced an agenda that most people did not want. A global agenda that says there's no borders, or we can easily handle 10 million people. We want 10 million people from the poorest places in the world without audit. Transgenderism. I would never believe that we would simply walk away from a 20-year presence in Afghanistan, leave $1 billion embassy, a $350 million outfitted air base, and $50 to $60 billion in very deadly weapons in the hands of terrorists. But we did. I never imagined that a balloon would take 14 days to go to Alaska and go over sensitive areas, taking photographs for China. We didn't do anything. So we're all, I guess, again, we're in new areas, and the people don't like this. We can see that with the polls. But the problem is that in our system, the institutions have the power. So the universities have gone pretty much, and I work at one, crazy, but that's not the majority of the students. It's just the faculty, a minority of the students, and the administration. But they have the power to drop the SAT, or to admit on the basis of race, or to create a new curriculum that no one ever dreamed of: gender studies, race studies, environmental, all these dash study courses. So I guess what I'm saying is that we're becoming a bifurcated society, in the sense that the middle class is shrinking, and then the mass of people don't like what the elite are doing to them. But the elite can do that to them because they have taken over all of our institutions, whether it's the NBA finals or the Oscar ceremonies or the Grammys or the White House Correspondents' Dinner or a new Hollywood picture or Netflix offerings. They're all from a particular ideological point of view that does not constitute a majority in America. And that's where the tension comes from, because they feel that they will be out of power and that agenda cannot be advanced if the people speak. And so you can see what's happening in 2024. It's not really about the Trump 4 years and the present Biden 4 years. It's about, we believe that he poses an existential threat to America. Therefore, we're going to use the legal system to put him in jail or break him financially or psychologically or physically, run up $1 billion in legal fees and fines so that he's an inert candidate by November. And we've never seen anybody do that before. So yeah, I'm very worried, and I think people have to, according to their stations, speak up. And all these examples from history, there were very serious internal tensions in these cities. There was strife. There was a coup at Carthage. There was Constantinople. They were fighting back and forth of whether they should ally themselves with Catholics or just stay an outnumbered Byzantine Christianity. And they were not united, and the enemies knew that. And I think people that are looking at us are aghast at these tensions in the United States. They simply, at the Hoover Institution, when we have visitors, and when I go abroad a couple times a year, I'm just always amazed at people who say they can't believe what's happening in the United States. And they don't mean that to put us down. They're kind of scared, because they'll tell you, we rely on you for protection, or are we under your nuclear shield, or what are you going to do about Putin or Xi? And so they're very worried that we're not up to the global responsibilities we claim that we are. And I think they're right about that.
I have a very hard time looking at where we are right now and trying to make sense of it. My son and daughter-in-law brought in a guest from Israel. She was Jewish for, I guess, about a week and a half. Before that, she lived till probably about age 20 in Russia. And one of the gifts I gave her at a dinner we did for her was a little flag pin that had the American flag and the Israeli flag, and I also gave her one that had the Texas flag. That's where I'm actually at right now, a few miles from Texas A&M, and the Israeli flag. And she thanked us, and then very quickly put it in her purse. And she said, "I'm going to hide this, so we don't get attacked." And I never in my life would have thought that someone would have put an item like that away very quickly in America because they were afraid of being attacked. And when I look at all these, I don't want to know if I'm going to call them riots or sit-ins or whatever you want to call them, happening at the universities by these students who are shouting death to Israel, death to America, from the river to the sea. And I just don't understand how that manifested, quite frankly, because a lot of these kids, if you ask them what they're protesting, they can't really articulate it. If you ask them, okay, what river, what sea, they don't know. And if they ask, why are you protesting the university? What do you want them to do? They can't even come up with, divest from Israel. They don't really know why they're out there in many cases, at least from what I'm seeing in interviews that were done on site. So can you tell me why this seems to be so popular with college students?
Well,
And you're saying it's not, it's just a handful.
yeah, well, it's about a third or a
Okay.
half are sympathetic, but where the real violence is and the anti-Semitism is mostly in big blue cities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, MIT, Chicago, George Washington, Northeastern, Northwestern, and UCLA, USC. And there's a perception among the students that these are blue states with blue governors, blue mayors, and blue administrators and blue faculty. And they saw what happened on January 6th vis-a-vis May, June, July, August, September, October 2020, when there was $2 billion in damage, 35 killed, 1,500, and there were no consequences. So they believe that the college president, they believe the faculty are with them, and that's true. They believe the college presidents are secretly with them and will never just say they're anti-Semitic, which they are, but will always say, well, on the one hand, we have to stop anti-Semitism. On the other hand, Islamophobia, which really doesn't exist, manifest itself on the campus. And then they believe if they were to be arrested, they'll be let out, and they say that by a blue city prosecutor or mayor, governor. And then, as to your question, they don't know anything. That's a product, a long-term, of a decline in standards. And short-term, we should remember that 3 out of 4 of these classes of freshman, sophomore, junior were admitted without the SAT and without a comparative ranking of their high school GPA in the wake of George Floyd. So we went to kind of repertory admission. So we have students there, and Stanford, where I work, let in the last 3 years, 20% of their admitting class were white, 9% white males, which meant, given legacies and athletes and kids of faculty, almost no white males were allowed in on merit. And the SAT was not required. In fact, those who took it optionally, 70% of those who got very hard to get a perfect score. They rejected 70% of them. So what I'm getting at is that you've got a new group of students on the campus that can't do the work as the university defined the work just 5 years ago. And so they're demanding water down the courses, give everybody A's as Yale, 80% A's, Stanford, 65% A's. Give us new courses. We want professors in these studies classes that are easy. At the same time this was happening, these universities depend on annual giving for their operating budget. Their huge endowments are locked up, and the income is usually rolled over. And they really prize the million foreign students who don't get any discounts. In fact, they pay a premium, full class. And we have about 1/3 Chinese students and well over 200,000 from illiberal regimes in the Middle East. So when you put all of that together, you've got these students who are very insecure that they can't do the work. Many of them don't belong there. They know that. They're angry about it. They say it's racist or it's homophobia, whatever the ism or ology is. And then you got a hardcore group of people who are not Americans. They're on student visas, or they're activists that aren't even students from the Middle East. And they lead by the nose these students who think this is really cool to be against a white settler, imperialist, neo-colonial, whatever the word is about Israel. They've never been to Israel, they don't know. And they think it's kind of neat to go after, very successful, very bright Jewish students. They don't ask Jewish students, are you for or against Israel? They're anti-Semitic. They just go after them. And so if the tragic thing, it could be stopped very quickly. All a president would have to do would say, as Ben Sassa did in Florida, if you break the rules, you will be suspended. And if you're a foreign student and you're suspended, you're going to lose your student visa and you're going to have to go back to your homeland. And we know from what they said is they do not want to go back to Jordan or Egypt or the West Bank or Gaza or Syria or Iraq. You just don't want to do it, or the Gulf. They love it here, even though they attack us verbally and they praise the very places they don't want to go back to. It's very weird. And then if you told the students, and you notice that when they are rarely suspended, they almost turn into a fetal position and cry and whine. It's so important to get that letter after their name. But if you were it only would take one or two college presidents to do that at these campuses, and one or two city attorneys to put them in jail when they break the law and incarcerate them for 6 weeks and fine them. But until you reestablish deterrence, I think it's like a fad, almost like cramming people into a telephone booth or swallowing goldfish for young people, but not the organizers. The organizers are Middle Eastern students, and they wear headbands, they have Hamas flags, and Hamas knows that the longer they can hold out and use human shields at mosques and hospitals and schools in Gaza, and the more they can whip up Western unrest in the street, Golden Gate St. Patrick's Cathedral, Times Square, Christmas, the Manhattan Bridge, the more they can do that, disrupt graduations, people will just say in the West and Europe, the United States, make it all go away, whatever they want, just calm down. And that's working for them. And that's why Joe Biden, he's so worried about these mythical voters in Michigan that he's interrupting congressionally approved aid to Israel. So it could be stopped very easily, but it's not stopped because there are people in positions of authority that are sympathetic to it.
This book contains so much extremely valuable information that everybody needs to pay attention to. And I've tried to do it justice over the 30 minutes that we've had together. But I'll ask you before we close, is there anything in the book that we haven't covered that you would like to make sure gets out, that you would like to make sure my listeners hear that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I think we have to be very careful when we look at people who pose a threat and we think they're ignorant, or they're barbaric, or they're savage. And I think we don't realize that people in Hamas and Hezbollah often have engineering degrees from Europe. But what I'm getting at is, as I said, Alexander the Great thought he was an intellectual. So did Scipio, so did Mehmet, so did Cortez. These were very learned people, and they were very systematic in what they did. And they saw no contradiction from mass slaughter, from enslavement, with their sense of education and privilege and being an elite. In fact, they thought that their education and their ability to speak well and write well was an added incentive to kill well. And I think sometimes we just think everybody's like Genghis Khan or everybody's like a barbarian, but it doesn't work that way in history. The people who planned the final solutions had PhDs in linguistics. So it's usually intellectuals that are at the tip of the spear. In the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, Robespierre was a very learned lawyer, and the same thing with the Bolsheviks, with Lenin and Trotsky. And that's how revolutions start and mass death starts. It's never done by just unorganized brutes that you can easily identify and defeat. It's sophisticated people that pose a threat.
The name of the book is The End of Everything, How Wars Descend into Annihilation by Victor Davis Hanson. Professor Hanson, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was an absolute honor having you here.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.